On December 24, 2014, while people were busy preparing for the upcoming new year, Yang Hongxin, an elderly man from Hongchang Town, Yuzhou City, Hunan Province, was filled with anxiety. His eldest son, Yang Huabing, 36 at the time, had been missing for several days. Desperate for answers, Yang Hongxin approached his daughter-in-law, Wang Tsonghui, for information. Wang calmly explained, "Huabing went out for work." "What time did he leave?" the elder pressed. "At 7 a.m., she replied. "Who did he go with?" "Alone," Wang answered. According to Wang, the couple had a fight over trivial matters 2 days earlier. After their argument, Yang Huabing had left home to find work. Since they were in a Cold War, he hadn't shared where he was headed. But with the new year just around the corner, Yang Huabing's sudden departure without a word felt suspicious to his father. Reflecting on the situation, Yang Hongxin said, "Something didn't add up. The bus to Beijing doesn't leave until 10:30 a.m., but she said he left at 7 a.m. Huabing usually sleeps in and isn't the type to wake up that early." Wang Tsonghui's explanation left Yang Hongxin uneasy. Determined to find his son, he began searching everywhere Yang Huabing might have gone. However, no matter where he looked, there were no signs of him. It was then that Yang Hongxin remembered something that had happened a few months before his son's disappearance. After a quarrel over a card game, Wang Tsonghui, still furious that night, had taken a kitchen knife and placed it against Yang Huabing's neck while he was asleep. He felt something pressing against his neck, and when he opened his eyes, he saw her holding a kitchen knife against his throat, Yang Hongxin recalled. His neck had a shallow cut, not enough to bleed, but it scared him to death. That night, the sharp pain jolted Yang Huabing awake, only to discover his wife's extreme actions. He immediately called the police. Following the incident, Wang Tsonghui was detained at a local detention center. However, considering that their children had no one else to care for them and believing that his daughter-in-law acted out of temporary anger, Yang Hongxin persuaded his son to withdraw the charges. This allowed the couple to reconcile and return to normal life. But now, with his son's sudden disappearance, could she be involved again? This troubling question lingered in the elderly man's mind, though he hesitated to dwell on it too long. A bold and shocking suspicion had already taken root deep within him. "It's been 2,120 days and he has never answered my calls. That's not normal," the father reflected. "I even spoke to his former boss and said, I think something terrible might have happened to him. I suspect Wang Tsonghui might have done something to him." At the time, Wang Tsonghui was also 36 years old. She and Yang Huabing had been married for 17 years and had a son and a daughter together. Their daily life was often marked by arguments due to Yang Huabing's short temper and gambling habits. Could she really have gone so far this time as to harm him fatally? Just as Yang Huabing's father was consumed with worry and unable to find peace, something unexpected happened. The Yang family suddenly received a text message from Yang Huabing. The message read, "Dad, I've gone out to work. Please stop calling me. Give money to Tsonghui, not me. I won't come back until I've made something of myself. I've been taken to a black factory. Don't tell Mom, her health isn't good. I can't make calls because we're being watched all the time. They're forcing us to produce fake oil. I'm sending this message while hiding under the covers. I think I'm in a nearby city." The sudden text from Yang Huabing left his father, Yang Hongxin, with mixed emotions. On one hand, he felt a glimmer of hope. His missing son had finally reached out. On the other, the mention of a black factory filled him with dread. How could his sharp-minded son have ended up in such a place? Feeling helpless, Yang Hongxin repeatedly dialed his son's number, but it was never answered. "I have so many guesses," the elder shared. "Could he have been caught up in a pyramid scheme? I've heard that illegal pyramid schemes confiscate phones. Maybe that's what happened. But even so, wouldn't he at least call back once?" Where exactly was Yang Huabing? Had he really fallen into the hands of a black factory? Just as his family was consumed by anxiety, an even more unexpected event occurred. Yang Huabing's phone suddenly rang and connected. On the other end of the line, a man's voice said coldly, "Speak." The elder immediately realized it wasn't his son. "I asked him, 'Who are you?' This doesn't sound like Huabing," Yang Hongxin recalled. The man responded curtly with another "Speak" before abruptly hanging up. The call was so brief that Yang Hongxin didn't have a chance to confirm the man's identity before the line went dead. Who was this man? Was he connected to Yang Huabing's disappearance? Yang Hongxin couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. Something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, he called the police, hoping they would intervene. Soon, officers from the Yuzhou City Public Security Bureau arrived at the Yang household. They began interviewing Yang's family and neighbors, uncovering several suspicious details about his disappearance. First of all, he had never worked outside the village before, one officer noted. "Through our interviews, we found that people generally described Yang Huabing as idle and somewhat lazy. None of his close friends had heard about any plans for him to work out of town. Even if he did want to leave, he would have at least told his father or informed a relative. But this time he told no one, not his wife, not his family, and didn't mention a destination or companions. All of this is highly unusual." To quickly determine Yang Huabing's whereabouts, the police conducted extensive investigations at numerous factories in the area, based on the information provided by his father. Unfortunately, no clues linked to Yang Huabing were found. After further analysis, investigators began to suspect that Yang's disappearance was unlikely to be accidental. "We suspected that Yang Huabing might have been murdered," one investigator recalled. He had a violent temper and a domineering personality. Someone like that wouldn't easily be controlled. All signs pointed to the possibility that he had met with foul play. If the investigators' suspicions were correct and Yang Huabing had indeed been killed, the next question was, who could the perpetrator be? Who was the man who sent the text message and answered Yang's father's phone call? After several days of meticulous investigation, a new and critical lead emerged. One that shifted attention back to Yang's wife, Wang Tsonghui, as the primary suspect. All evidence began to converge on Wang Tsonghui. First, her explanation that Yang had left home to work seemed implausible. Additionally, investigators uncovered that Wang was involved in an extramarital affair. This revelation placed her squarely at the center of the investigation into Yang's disappearance. Given the existence of a third party, investigators speculated whether Wang and her lover might have plotted to eliminate Yang Huabing to be together. To avoid arousing suspicion, they secretly enlisted Yang's father to search his son's home for clues. Days passed and Yang Huabing's father searched every corner of the house, but no valuable clues surfaced. Still, he was convinced that his son's disappearance was somehow connected to the household. It was then that a seemingly insignificant detail caught his attention. The vegetable patch in the yard appeared unusual. There were spinach plants growing in that plot, covered with a thick layer of grass, the elder recalled. When I returned one day, I noticed the ground looked unusually smooth, and the grass had been completely cleared. It felt strange. Someone had clearly worked on that patch recently. As a retired soldier with 6 years of service and a passion for detective novels, Yang's father couldn't ignore a bold thought that crept into his mind. Could something be buried under that patch? Could it even be his missing son? The idea sent chills down his spine, but he resolved to find out the truth. Waiting until his daughter-in-law left the house, he quickly locked the door, grabbed a shovel, and started digging up the vegetable patch. I was holding on to a glimmer of hope, but I couldn't dismiss the worst-case scenario, he recounted. As I dug, I noticed the soil was surprisingly loose. The shovel went in with almost no resistance. That confirmed my suspicions. The elder continued, as I dug deeper, I found grass and vegetable leaves buried beneath the soil. It was clear to me that the ground had been dug up and then refilled. He kept digging. Near the roots of a tree, he unearthed 2 torn pieces of fabric. When he looked closer, a chill ran down his spine. I knew instantly, it was my son's clothing. My son wasn't just missing, he had been murdered. Overcome with shock and horror, he immediately called 110 to report his discovery. Upon receiving the call, officers from the Yuzhou City Public Security Bureau quickly arrived at the scene. Forensic experts excavated the area further and uncovered a male body wrapped in a bedsheet, partially burned. After identification, the body was confirmed to be that of Yang Huabing, who had been missing for over 20 days. A forensic examination revealed the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in fatal brain injuries. Investigators immediately brought the suspect, Wang Tsonghui, in for questioning while she was working in the fields. During the interrogation, Wang confessed to conspiring with her lover, Yang Xinfeng, to murder Yang Huabing and bury his body in the family's vegetable patch. On the evening of January 10, 2015, under police escort, Wang Tsonghui and Yang Xinfeng separately led officers to the primary crime scene and the location where they had discarded the murder weapon. "You go ahead," a police officer instructed Wang. "Confirm if this is the primary crime scene." "This is the place," Wang replied. The officer then asked, "What was the weapon used?" "A small metal pin. We stabbed him 11 times with it." "Where was the pin kept before?" "By the appliances." "How did you know it was there?" "Because I often used it to pin my hair. It was always kept in that spot." Throughout the questioning, Wang remained calm and composed. She pointed out the small room where she and Yang Xinfeng had plotted and carried out the murder of Yang Huabing. Yet, as Wang Tsonghui returned to the familiar courtyard, beneath her calm exterior, she might have been overwhelmed with an infinite mix of sorrow and conflicting emotions. This small yard was once where she and Yang Huabing had shared 17 years of married life, a space filled with memories of their marriage and their children's laughter. What could have driven her to become so cold-hearted and destroy it all with her own hands? In truth, the seeds of this tragedy were sown over a decade earlier. In 1996, 18-year-old Wang Tsonghui met Yang Huabing at a sewing workshop. A year later they got married. However, in the conservative rural setting where they lived, interactions between young men and women were limited, and Wang and Yang had barely gotten to know each other before tying the knot. In the early days of their marriage, Wang Tsonghui had high hopes for their life together. But it didn't take long for her to discover many habits in Yang Huabing that she found intolerable, leading to constant arguments. Even after their daughter was born, Yang's behavior remained unchanged. He never acted like a family man and lived as if he were still single. He didn't care about anything at home or the children, Wang Tsonghui admitted. He was addicted to gambling and even resorted to petty theft. I often asked myself, why did I marry someone like him? Despite her frustrations, Wang couldn't bring herself to consider divorce, largely out of respect for her kind-hearted in-laws. At that time, divorce wasn't even on my mind. I thought maybe my sincerity could change him, she said. Yang Huabing's family lived in a rural area of Hongchang town, and his parents' living conditions were modest. After marriage, Yang continued his idle lifestyle, leaving most household expenses to be covered by his parents' support. However, their sacrifices did little to reform him. He frequently caused trouble outside, often bringing conflict to their doorstep and forcing the family to deal with the consequences. My biggest wish back then was to have a house with a proper wall, Wang reminisced. We lived in constant fear with people showing up to make trouble. Even the front door was smashed several times. In an effort to save money for building a proper house, Wang Zonghui convinced Yang Huabing to join her in working in Zhejiang. Despite being pregnant again at the time, she worked tirelessly, putting in over 10 hours a day. A year later, they managed to save more than 30,000 yuan. With their dream within reach, Wang felt a surge of excitement and hope. But her excitement was short-lived. One day, she discovered that all the money in their bank account had vanished. I felt like the sky was falling, Wang recalled. That money was earned through so much hard work. I just wanted our family to live better, but he took it all. It turned out that the money, painstakingly saved over a year through frugality and labor, had been withdrawn by Yang Huabing and lost entirely to gambling. To Wang, that 30,000 yuan wasn't just their hard-earned savings. It symbolized the hope for a better future. The loss of that hope plunged her into deep despair. I seriously thought about ending my life, Wang admitted. I held a blade to my wrist, thinking I couldn't go on, but I also couldn't bring myself to die. I felt completely trapped. No matter how much I begged or tried to reason with him, nothing could awaken his conscience. It felt like saving him was an impossible task. Her despair deepened when Yang Huabing was sentenced to a year in prison for intentional injury. Left to care for 2 children on her own, Wang Zonghui also had to endure constant gossip and judgment from those around her. Despite the hardship, she never considered ending her marriage, choosing instead to believe that this experience would be a turning point for her husband. In his letters to me, he said it was the most important lesson of his life, Wang recalled. He promised that once he got out, he would turn his life around and live with dignity. Holding on to this hope, Wang convinced herself that such a harsh lesson would surely help him mature. I kept believing that he would change, that he'd come back a different person, she said. It was this belief that led her to forego opportunities that could have changed her fate. As a woman, I felt that once you marry someone, you should stick with that marriage. I always thought marriage meant staying true to it no matter what, Wang admitted. But looking back on their years together, Wang slowly came to realize that her faith in their marriage was nothing more than wishful thinking. The reality was that Yang Huabing hadn't changed after his time in prison. He returned with the same destructive habits. One late night, a group of men exuding hostility showed up at their door. They said I had money in my account, so he brought those people home, Wang Zonghui recounted. They kicked open the door to the small room on the west side. It was the middle of the night, and my mom and I were startled awake. They kept pressuring us to repay the debt, demanding 20,000 or 30,000 yuan at a time. They even threatened my dad, saying that if we didn't pay, they'd sell my mom. That night, after managing to send the debt collectors away, Wang and Yang erupted into a heated argument fueled by years of pent-up resentment. The quarrel escalated into a physical altercation, and Wang, being smaller and weaker, was at a clear disadvantage against the tall and strong Yang Huabing. Overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and despair, she reached out to Yang's friend Yang Xinfeng and called him for help. She told me she was feeling terrible and completely overwhelmed, Yang Xinfeng recalled. She said she couldn't take it anymore. I tried to comfort her and then suggested, if you decide to get a divorce, I wish you well. You deserve a better life and a happier family. After all you've been through, I truly hope you find happiness. When I said that, she seemed deeply moved, Yang Xinfeng continued. She had never opened up to anyone about her pain before, let alone leaned on someone's shoulder and cried. It was like all the emotions she had suppressed for so long finally found an outlet. Having someone care about her and offer comfort gave her a sense of emotional support she hadn't felt in years. Yang Xinfeng was originally a barber in the village and had been childhood friends with Yang Huabing. Their relationship remained close over the years. Whenever conflicts arose between Yang Huabing and Wang Zonghui, Yang Huabing would often call on the mild-mannered Yang Xinfeng to mediate. Over time, Wang began to develop feelings for the steady and ambitious man she saw in Yang Xinfeng, while he grew increasingly sympathetic toward her plight. That night, under the influence of alcohol, the two crossed a moral line and embarked on an affair. After Wang Zonghui and Yang Xinfeng got involved, her relationship with my son deteriorated, Yang Huabing's father recalled. A man in his 30s should be in the prime of his life, full of energy. But when my son came home, he wouldn't even step inside the house, let alone show any intimacy with his wife. Their relationship was not just cold, it filled my daughter-in-law with fear. There are things I don't even know how to describe, Wang said. He would buy whatever he fancied, especially certain adult materials. If he saw it, he bought it. The house was piled high with all these things that imitated other people's lives. Despite the comfort she found in Yang Xinfeng, Wang knew that the ties of reality wouldn't allow this warmth to last. She still hoped that her husband, Yang Huabing, would change and step up to his responsibilities as a husband and father. However, a sudden phone call shattered her final hopes and plunged her into despair. Over the phone, Wang Zonghui learned that her husband had racked up over 100,000 yuan in gambling debts from loan sharks. How could this already impoverished family possibly repay such an enormous sum? To pay off the debt, my mom and I went to work at a massage parlor, Wang Zonghui's child recalled. My dad said the wages there were high and could help us repay the money. But those places were shady, and he must have known that, yet he still sent us there. He told us that if we didn't do what he said, he'd kill our whole family, Wang said. The fear and terror I felt were indescribable. He stripped me of any chance at happiness, leaving me with no way out. However, what Wang Zhonghui failed to realize was that the real thief of her happiness wasn't Yang Huabing, it was herself. It was her repeated, boundaryless compromises and enabling that emboldened this man to become utterly reckless. And yet, she foolishly believed that eliminating Yang Huabing would somehow free her from the bottomless pit she found herself in. Determined to act, she turned to her lover Yang Xinfeng to plot the plan. She told me she had made up her mind this time, Yang Xinfeng recalled. She said, "This time it's either him or me. I'm ready to die if I have to." She felt there were no other options left. "I didn't want to kill him, I just felt completely cornered," Wang Zhonghui explained. "He even threatened my niece-in-law's unborn child. When even an innocent unborn baby was at risk, I couldn't tolerate it anymore. I thought, if someone has to die, let it be the bad person, not the good ones." To Wang, this decision wasn't merely about revenge, it was also about relief. "I pitied Yang Huabing so much that I thought if Yang Xinfeng killed him, it wouldn't just free me and my family, but the whole village as well." The fateful day arrived on December 20, 2014, Yang Huabing's birthday. Knowing her husband's habits, Wang anticipated that he would drink heavily that evening. Planning ahead, she gave a spare house key to Yang Xinfeng, and the two decided to carry out their plan once Yang was drunk and defenseless. As expected, Yang invited a few friends over to celebrate his birthday with food and drinks at home. After several rounds of alcohol, Yang, too intoxicated to continue, staggered to the bedroom and collapsed into bed. Meanwhile, Wang, burdened by the weight of her sinister plan, lay awake all night, anxiously awaiting the moment when it would unfold. Finally, hours later, a few barks pierced the silence of the night. Wang Zhonghui knew the person she had been waiting for had arrived. He asked me, "Is he asleep?" Wang recalled. I said yes. Then he asked, "Is he facing south or east?" I told him, "He's facing south." He asked if the iron rod was ready, and I said it was in the west room in its usual spot. After this brief exchange, Yang Xinfeng nodded in understanding and headed into Yang Huabing's bedroom, while Wang stayed outside the door waiting. Inside, Yang Huabing lay sound asleep, completely unaware that death was creeping closer. However, as Yang Xinfeng prepared to strike, Yang Huabing seemed to sense something and suddenly woke up. "Did he wake up?" Yang Xinfeng recounted. He asked me, "What are you doing?" I told him, "Weren't you the one planning to kill Wang Zhonghui?" But honestly, I was terrified myself. I'd had a few drinks, and my hands were shaking as I held the iron rod. Despite the meticulous planning, Yang Xinfeng hadn't anticipated Yang Huabing waking up at the critical moment. Panicking and ignoring the fact that Yang's child was still sleeping nearby, he swung the iron rod and struck Yang Huabing's head with brutal force. He continued to strike until there was no longer any response. Only then did he stop. After confirming that Yang Huabing was dead, the pair carried his body out of the east room and placed it into a large vat in the adjacent main house. Yang Xinfeng then poured a container of gasoline he had brought with him over the body and set it on fire. At that time, there was a rural superstition that burning a body would prevent the soul from reincarnating and stop it from haunting others, Wang Zhonghui later explained, describing their motive for the gruesome act. After a night filled with fear and chaos, the next morning, the two began cleaning up the crime scene. They wiped the bloodstains off the walls and dug a large pit in the courtyard, where they buried Yang Huabing's remains. To cover their tracks, Yang Xinfeng took Yang Huabing's SIM card and, thinking he was being clever, used the phone to send misleading text messages to Yang's family, claiming that he had been taken by a black market factory. On April 12, 2016, the Xuchang Intermediate People's Court conducted a trial for this case. The court found that the defendants, Yang Xinfeng and Wang Zhonghui, had maintained an improper extramarital relationship, violating social and familial ethics. Amid escalating domestic conflicts, instead of seeking legal ways to protect their rights, they repeatedly plotted and ultimately carried out the murder of Yang Huabing. Their actions were deemed cruel with severe consequences, constituting the crime of intentional homicide. The court issued the following verdict. Defendant Yang Xinfeng was sentenced to death and permanently stripped of his political rights. Defendant Wang Zhonghui was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve and permanently stripped of her political rights. In January 2015, Wang Zhonghui was detained at the Xuchang Detention Center. During her early days there, she was consumed by an overwhelming mix of guilt, despair, and resentment, which constantly tormented her. She became withdrawn, often silent, and exhibited signs of deep emotional distress.